Okay. I'm going to see if I can make it bigger. Okay, is that better? Yeah, okay. Just going to read this paper. So this is from a Seventh-day Adventist named Reimar from Andrews University, which is Seventh-day Adventist. This is written in 2003. I think it's written for their journal. It's it's where they teach. It's the seminary for America, and where the center of scholarly work comes from. Okay, so this is called A Definition and Short History of Historicism as a Method for Interpreting Daniel and Revelation. The main approach Adventists have taken to the books of Daniel and Revelation, the so-called historicist method of prophetic interpretation, was no invention of Adventists. It was the most commonly used approach throughout most of church history. Yet, today, few outside the denomination share the approach, and it seems hard even to get others to understand the Adventist position. This article will reflect on ways the term historicism has been understood and communicated by Adventists. Okay. I will suggest some elements that might be useful to share in conversations with non-Adventist interpreters, namely a definition of historicism and a brief history of its prominent usage throughout church history. Follow-up articles by John Pauling, another currently active scholar in Seventh-day Adventist circles, will reflect on and evaluate the historicist method in light of recent scholarship and some select cases from the biblical data. The nature of historicism. Historicism as school of interpretation. The traditional way Adventists use the term historicism in relation to interpretation of prophecy is as a comprehensive system or school of interpretation. Historicism is here seen as exclusive. An interpreter using historicism for some parts of Daniel or Revelation cannot use another approach like preterism or futurism for other parts. And personal. William Shea, who's passed away, represents many Adventists in his usage of the term historicism when he writes, "Through the ages, several different methods of interpreting Daniel and Revelation have been proposed. The historicist method sees these prophecies as being fulfilled through the course of human history, beginning at the time of the prophets who wrote them. Preterism sees Daniel as focusing on the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, and it seems the book of Revelation as focusing especially on the reign of the Emperor Nero. Thus, the preterist school focuses upon the past. In contrast to this, the futurist school places the major emphasis on these two books in the future, yet to be fulfilled. A specially prominent branch of futurism is dispensationalism, which narrows this future fulfillment for the last 7 years of Earth's history." That's from Shea's book, Historicism, The Best Way to Interpret Prophecy. In Shea's understanding of the term historicism cannot be used alongside other approaches. The interpreter must choose one method and stick with that for all of Daniel and Revelation. No combination of these three methods has ever been successful. A brief flirtation with such an attempt was contemplated in the 1980s under the claim that interpreters are correct in what they advocate and wrong in what they deny, but it did not work. Shea shows how interpreters with historicist, preterist, and futurist approaches have arrived at conflicting positions on many prophecies. Thus, he argues choosing the historicist approach entails denying other approaches. Both of these schools, historicism and futurism, use the same prophecies but see their fulfillment in different places. These suggested fulfillments are so very different there is no way they can be combined. Historicism and futurism claim that much in these prophecies goes beyond those preterist endpoints, so there is no way to combine these systems. The interpreter has to choose among these three methods. The reader might wonder why it is not conceivable that Daniel and Revelation might consist of different types of prophecies, so that some sections were intended by the ancient author to be understood with the preterist approach, that is, the author writing about events from his own day and earlier. Another section to be read with the historicist approach, a prediction of events between the author and the eschaton, and another section intended to be read with the futurist approach, predicting events surrounding the parousia. Behind this all or nothing logic is an important assumption seldom stated. Historicism should be understood to include the time periods of preterism, the ancient author's own time, and futurism, eschatological events. Whenever we read a section of Daniel or Revelation that seems to be referring to events contemporary with the author, the interpreter who favored the historicist approach for another prophecy cannot now claim the label of preterism in this case. Once you use the historicist method, everything else you do is by definition also historicism. And then here's an illustration on a historical timeline here, all or nothing kind of thing. The advantage of historicism is that it includes the time periods. And then in some cases, historicists might be accused of being preterist or futurist when in reality, they're just recognizing the application. As you can see, preterism would be past, futurism only future, historicism advocating that, there's a succession of kingdoms from Daniel's time forward till the stone hits the feet. You might think God might include some of the periods of, the new covenant timeline in his prediction of the future. How hard is it to make a system where nothing's, most of it hasn't even occurred yet, and then declare everybody else wrong? Historicism recognizes the obvious logical implication of God being sovereign, and that is telling history, particularly during the period of his fullness of salvation being brought in his books that tell the future, that he wouldn't leave us blank without prophecy throughout our history as new covenant believers. It's my little side rant there. Historicism as one label among many. A quite different way of using the term historicism sees it as one approach among many that one and the same interpreter might use. Historicism is here an appropriate label for the way the interpreter reads one section of a prophecy, but the way the interpreter reads other sections might receive other labels like preterism or futurism. Here's an illustration of historicism as one label among many. And then you see like in between rather than over encompassing. Ranko Stefanovich argues that not all sections of John's Apocalypse are suited for the historicist approach. A good commentary on Revelation does not favor any particular one of the traditional approaches. This method of interpretation an author chooses normally governs the way he or she reads and interprets the text. It usually results in forcing an interpretation into the framework of a predetermined idea, regardless whether or not it fits in the context. The exposition of the text must be controlled by the intent of its author, who should tell us what we are supposed to find in it. If the message of the studied text was primarily for John's day, then it calls for the preterist or idealist approach. On the other hand, if it discusses the very end times, then its interpretation calls for a futurist approach. If the studied text presents the events occurring throughout the course of history, however, a sound interpretation calls for a historicist approach to the text. Strong evidence must demonstrate that the scenes and symbols in the text point to events throughout all of history, rather than those primarily in John's time or the time of the end. It's important to notice that this is not the same as a multiple fulfillment approach. Stefanovich, as I understand him, does not suggest that one and the same section of Daniel or Revelation has more than one fulfillment in history. Each prophetic prediction addresses only one place, long or short, on the timeline of history. The placement on this timeline determines the label. Preterism, historicism, or futurism. Now let's evaluate that. The author evaluates it. Both ways of understanding the term historicism have their strengths and their weaknesses. The first and traditional use of the term, historicism as an all or nothing school, has the benefit that it emphasizes the important distinctions of the Adventist approach. Belief in the possibility of true predictive prophecy is an important aspect not shared with all interpreters. Historicist interpretations give the message of a God who is in control of history and able to foretell events before they take place. And of course, so does the futurist. Or more so, right? Those two views do that. And that's where we have commonality with some aspects of prophecy. Much less so with the preterist, who may have portions that were in the future of the author's time, of course. So back to the article. By personalizing the definition, in talking about historicist and preterist interpreters rather than merely about historicist and preterist methods, the reader of Adventist expositions of prophecy is called upon to take a stand and choose a side. Thus, this us versus them language has probably contributed to a positive sense of identity and fellowship among Adventists. On the negative side, by linking the methods so completely with the interpreter and demanding exclusive loyalty to one method, this traditional way of defining historicism has also contributed to a more difficult dialogue with the rest of the Christian world. Because Adventists raised the fence and offered a take it or leave it approach, interpreters outside Adventism mostly stopped listening. Big mistake. This is why Adventists like to say they are in the Protestant lineage and appreciate the Protestant lineage because we agree with the Protestant lineage, and particularly the fact that America exists because of Protestantism, and all the Protestant reformers were vessels of God in their time and place according to the light that they were given. The package could not be sold in toto, and so the non-Adventist audience dwindled even on limited exegetical case studies, particularly regarding the book of Revelation. Now, the second approach, the more limited way of using the term historicism as a label only for some parts of the prophecy, might improve matters in this area. A dialogue with some of a different opinion usually improves by beginning with shared ground and building the dialogue about differences from that common foundation, rather than claiming unbridgeability up front. By demonstrating how both conversation partners read certain sections as related to events in the ancient author's time, and how both read some as describing events surrounding the parousia, the Adventist interpreter will more likely have an attentive audience when he or she goes on to show the sections of prophecy where events in history are predicted, at least if one carefully states the reasons for seeing history predicted there. The Adventist is not trying to sell an all-or-nothing package, but can present arguments for having chosen the historicist approach in each individual case. A second advantage of this limited definition of historicism is for internal research. To the degree that many Adventist lay people have begun to see larger parts of Revelation as still unfulfilled in comparison with the traditional Adventist interpretation, they might find it more convincing that Adventist scholars argue for the appropriateness of historicism for each individual disputed section, rather than branding them as being in error on a general abstract level, as in they are futurists instead of historicists. And since Daniel 2 clearly demands a historicist reading, they are wrong in seeing the future in Revelation chapter so-and-so. The 7 years of Daniel chapter 4 and the 7 churches of Revelation chapter 2 and 3 are examples of sections where some have applied historicism and seen predictions of future history, while others, including most Adventist scholars today, are not so convinced. The mentality must be to argue for every section one by one and not assume the appropriateness of historicism for a certain section without convincing arguments. It is not unlikely that historicism as one label among many may foster this important attitude better than the traditional historicism. The advantage of the traditional historicism as a school is the disadvantage of this second way of using the term. Since preterism, historicism, and futurism have histories as rich terms conveying many underlying values and assumptions, by choosing to view historicism only as one label among many, it is easy to overlook many important differences between Adventist and non-Adventist approaches to prophecy. We usually assume that scholars who read most of Daniel and Revelation with the preterist approach do so because they do not believe in the possibility of true predictive prophecy. Adventists emphatically and uncompromisingly hold that predictive prophecy has taken place in sections of Daniel and Revelation, like the futurist would. If historicism is redefined into one label among many, and Adventists begin conversations with non-Adventists on points of agreement for the benefits we saw above, one should not neglect to point out that the real and important differences that do exist. My personal judgment is that the traditional definition of historicism works better for discussions of Daniel and for Revelation. For Daniel chapters 2, 7, and 8, most interpreters will agree with the Adventist historicist that the text intends to describe events throughout history, events between the time of the intended author and the eschaton. Of course, that's something that's easily overlooked, but is, of course, is the case if you believe Daniel 2 was predictive at the time it was written. Disagreement narrows down to belief in the possibility of true predictive prophecy and the dating of the book. By describing the Adventist approach as an all-or-nothing school, the important issues of the debate are clarified. For the book of Revelation, however, I fear the pedagogical effect is the opposite. Most interpreters will not agree with Adventists that the text in some places intends to describe events throughout history. By Adventists appealing to historicism as a school, the non-Adventist interpreter thinks Millerism, recalling the heyday of the early 19th century, and conjures up images of the most creative and excessive kind of historicism. I find the proposal of Stefanovic and others appealing. They say that for John's apocalypse, it is better to cut up the pie in smaller pieces, showing which sections Adventists agree on placing in John's own day, noting in which sections eschatological parousia-related events are described, and then going on to argue for historicism only in the very sections where Adventists find predictions of the course of history. That is, give the evidence, make the arguments for that case. In the rest of this article, here's a definition of historicism. In the rest of the article, I will suggest some elements Adventists might include in conversations with non-Adventist interpreters. In this section, I propose a definition of historicism in the more narrow sense of the term. Thereafter, I sketch a short history of the use of the historicist approach, as I have defined it, throughout church history, so dialogue partners can know that Adventists stand in a long line of interpretation. Here's my proposed definition of historicism. Historicism reads historical apocalyptic as prophecy intended by its ancient author to reveal information about real in history events in the time span between the writer's day and the eschaton. No part of this definition is novel, but some comments may be valuable. Historicism reads. Notice that the subject of the definition is historicism, the approach, and not historicist, the interpreter using the approach, the advantage of which we discussed above. The next part of the definition, or historical apocalyptic, deals with the jurisdiction. Historicism is a method limited to certain types of apocalyptic literature. Most genres found in the Bible are excluded, as are apocalyptic writings where other heavenly realms are revealed, rather than future historical events in this world. It is the task of the interpreter to argue the case for historical apocalyptic in each individual section. One may hold one section or chapter of Daniel or Revelation to be historical apocalyptic, which clearly Revelation has heavenly realms in view. One may hold one section or chapter of Daniel or Revelation to be historical apocalyptic without automatically assuming that all the rest of the material in Daniel and Revelation is likewise intended to describe future history, intended by its ancient author. Given the growing scholarly interest in reader-oriented approaches, it is worth noting that a historicist interpretation is an exegetical task that aims at saying something about the intent of the author behind the prophecy. Divine inspiration and revelation behind the text and future events truly predicted, as Adventists believe of the biblical apocalypses, need not mean the ancient human author understood every detail of what they were inspired to write. But if one uses the historicist approach, one must assume that the authors somehow understood they were referring to future history. Because many interpreters in the past combined historicism with unchecked creativity and read many imaginary prediction fulfillments into the apocalyptic text, readers have got the false impression that historicism conveys merely what is in the eye of the modern beholder. Interpreters using the historicist method aim for more than expressing what is in their own minds. They hope to comment on something that is really in the text, as intended by whatever human and divine agents produced the text. This, I would argue that the advantage of the Adventist interpretation would be the focus on the work of Christ in the apocalyptic literature, and the more refined focus on exactly how that operates according to the new covenant and Christ ministering from the heavenly temple, as the book of Hebrews clearly and teaches in its theology. Reveal information about real in history events. So this is for you, Chris Lucas, because you ask about this. Historicism not only looks for the meaning applied in the text and intended by the author, as opposed to meaning created in the mind of the author, seeing things that aren't there, in other words, or misapplications of historical symbology, but claims to find authorial attempts at describing real historical events and developments. Developments being the key word. The Apocalypse group of the SBL Genres Project has defined an apocalypse as revelatory literature with a narrative framework in which a revelation is mediated by an otherworldly being to a human recipient, disclosing a transcendent reality which is both temporal, insofar as it envisages eschatological salvation. Again, Adventist interpretation does that marvelously. And spatial insofar as it involves another supernatural world. Although we might not believe in all the realities depicted in all the various apocalyptic writings from antiquity, few scholars today dispute that the ancient authors often intended to describe real events. When the ancient author intended to describe travels into heavenly realms or write timeless ahistorical fiction, historicism is not a suitable method to use to understand it. This is in regard to what I would say was inspired writings that were inspired by the books of Daniel, or by the book of Daniel, and which would be like the true apocalyptic literature from God. And so Daniel's not merely a book amongst many in that genre, but the OG, true apocalyptic. In the time span between his day and the eschaton. So he's like explaining his definition here, and this is this portion of his definition. In the time span between his day and the eschaton. The elements in our definition up to this point would fit equally well for the preterist and other approaches to apocalyptic literature within the historical critical and historical grammatical frameworks. What sets historicism apart is this last phrase. Did the ancient author intend to describe events to take place in the time span from the writing up until the eschaton? If we believe so about a passage, historicism is the approach we take. If the author of Daniel intended to describe events after his time, i.e. after the 6th century, early dating of the book, or after the 2nd century, the late dating, yet before the eschaton, then we have a case calling for a historicist approach. Likewise, if John the Revelator set out to predict events in a span of time after his days and up to the parousia. It is worth observing that one does not have to believe in divine foreknowledge and revelation in order to read a prophecy with a historicist approach. As I've defined it, historicism is not just for the believer. There are several ancient apocalypses around, and none of us believe in the truthfulness of all these attempted predictions. Historicism as a scholarly method only asks for a likely reconstruction of the original authorial intent of the writing. So you don't have to be a believer to take this approach to what the text is intending to suggest it's predicting. Whenever we think we see an author of an apocalypse attempting to foretell events placed in the future yet before the end of the world, we take the historicist approach, whether we consider those predictions to be true or not. History of historicism. In the traditional way of defining historicism as an all or nothing school of interpretation, appeals to the history of prophetic interpretation often tried to show how details from current Adventist expositions were shared by interpreters in the past. The whole school had to be justified from history, so to speak. If we reduced historicism to one label among many and use it only about events between, not including the author's day and the parousia, all we have to show by appealing to the history of interpretation is that many have believed in the possibility of true predictive prophecy and found it in parts of Daniel and Revelation. When the popularity of that has been demonstrated, the interpreter can turn from the history of prophetic interpretation to exegetical studies to show which parts of Daniel and Revelation he thinks specifically predict history. The list of prominent interpreters using the historicist approach for at least some part of Daniel or Revelation is quite impressive. Throughout most of history, since the writing of Daniel, historicism has been widely used. Jewish apocalyptic writings. Many Jewish apocalypses were written in the period 200 BC to 100 AD. James Tabor, I think, specializes in this, for instance. Whether we see them as influenced by and commenting upon the biblical book of Daniel, or see them merely as being written at the same time and in the same environment as Daniel, the nature of these apocalypses throw great light on Daniel. Interestingly, several of these apocalyptic writings clearly attempt predictions of the future, the time between the writing and the end of the world, historicist prophecies. In chapters 91 and 93 of the fifth book of First Enoch, we find a prophecy of 10 consecutive periods. Now, this is interesting, because this informs much of Daniel, because clearly this was likely written after Daniel and inspired by the same genre that Daniel, essentially, I would argue, as a believer, invented. Now, notice what we find. This informs us on common, and this book is very popular, including in the minds of the New Testament writers. Okay. In chapters 91 and 93 of the fifth book of First Enoch, we find a prophecy of 10 consecutive periods. Notice Daniel's 70 weeks are 10 jubilees, each lasting 1 week. The weeks are obviously symbolical, since events that take longer time than a literal week are mentioned, just like Daniel, right? The rebuilding of the temple. Daniel knew when he said 70 weeks that restoring Jerusalem would not be able to be done in 70 literal weeks, okay? A clue that literal time is not being used in the book of Daniel. And everybody accepts that's the case with the 70 weeks. Remember that. The weeks are obviously symbolical, since events that take longer than a literal week are mentioned, like the building of a house and a kingdom in week 5, or verse 7. John Collins comments, the substance of this apocalypse is made up not of heavenly cosmology, but of an overview of history. The history is highly schematized and organized into periods of weeks. This division into a set number of periods is a common feature of the historical type of apocalypse. Where does the ancient author see himself in this series of 10 periods? Collins thinks that the author saw 6 of the periods in the past. In the case of the apocalypse of weeks, the time of the real author is evidently to be situated in the 7th week. I think Enoch was the 7th from Adam as well, according to Genesis 5. If Collins is correct in this, these last periods call for the historicist approach. In the 7th period of the text mentions coming oppression, the Gentiles to be conquered, towers or castles to be overthrown, and many sinners to be destroyed. Notice this reflects the thinking of much of the Jewish understanding of what the Messiah would do according to Daniel in Christ's time, including the disciples. And we know that they were very much aware of this writing in the book of Enoch. In the 8th period, the week of righteousness, the righteous will prosper over against the oppressors and sinners. Of course, this is still referring to the first Enoch, chapter 91. In the 9th period, sin will disappear from the earth and moral perfection or uprightness take over. Finally, in the 10th, here, another reason to understand Enoch is not scripture, okay? Finally, in the 10th period, the day of God's final judgment takes place, executed by the angels. The first heaven departs and a new heaven appears, and eternity replaces temporality. Of course, you could extend it to the eschaton, according to scripture, right? Which hasn't occurred yet. In the apocalypse of Abraham, chapters 29 through 30, the writer receives a vision of 12 periods or hours of history that are to take place before the eschaton. The events of each period are listed in chapter 30, and the end of the world takes place in chapter 31. The historical axis is divided into 12 hours, a form of periodization that is also found in 2nd Baruch's vision, where in the series of 12, the author of Abraham saw himself is hard to determine. If he intended the 12 periods to be in his future, we need to interpret this apocalypse with the historicist approach. In 2nd Baruch chapter 27, we also find 12 periods of history with different events taking place. But it is not clear whether these are meant to cover the time span from the author to the eschaton, or are all part of the immediate events surrounding the end of the world itself. In the 5th vision, in chapters 11 through 12 of 4 Ezra, A symbolic vision of an eagle is given where different parts of the bird's body represent different time periods and reigning kings. The vision itself is in chapter 11, and the interpretation is given in chapter 12. This writing is clearly meant as an interpretation and elaboration of the biblical book of Daniel. Notice, Daniel is also properly interpreted in this method of chronology of writing, or giving the prophecy and then the explanation and then recapitulation, etc. In 12:11 through 15, the eagle is said to be a more detailed prophecy of the fourth kingdom in Daniel. First 12 kings will reign one after another, then another 8 kings, of which the last 2 will reign until the end, where 3 more kings will appear. Then a lion will appear, God's Messiah, and make an end of the eagle with its many kings. This eagle, explained by Ezra to be the fourth kingdom in Daniel, is interpreted by most scholars, including Collins, as Rome, as Daniel 7 should be. So the author of For Ezra clearly interprets Daniel with the historicist method, reading Daniel as a predictive prophecy about times beyond the day of the writer, or of Daniel, where in his series of Roman kings does the author of For Ezra see his own time? Does he believe that the end is imminent, or that many more kings are first to come? If the latter, then even the prophecy of For Ezra itself demands a historicist interpretation and suggests it, I would add. In the writings in the intertestamental period, largely inspired by Daniel, but yet not to be taken as part of the inspired canon, we see what kind of thinking they likely had regarding how they interpreted Daniel, as mirrored in the writings of these extra biblical books. That's the point. Other early Jewish interpretations. The translators behind the Alexandrian Septuagint, the early version, not the later Theodotian translation, read Daniel with the historicist approach, believing Daniel to contain predictions about future history. For instance, in Daniel 11:30, the ships of Kittim are interpreted and translated with the Romans. Sorry, preterists, but the fourth kingdom is not Greece, it is Rome, as understood by all of history, Jews and Christians included. The Jewish historian Josephus seems to interpret the fourth kingdom of Daniel 2 as the Roman Empire, and the stone kingdom as a future power that would overthrow the Romans. Jesus and the Synoptics. In Matthew 24:15, Jesus is said to refer to a prediction by Daniel the prophet, interpreting it as a future event. Mark 13:14 contains the same saying, but here only the prediction, clearly taken from Daniel, is given. The reference to Daniel is omitted. In the parallel account in Luke 21:21, Jesus also interprets the prophecy in Daniel as a future event and gives us even more detailed interpretation of it. The destruction of Jerusalem, in other words, and beyond, down to the end of the age and the end of the world, as the disciples asked. Whether one takes these sayings as authentic, as most Adventist scholars do, or as a product of the early Christian tradition, they are in any case evidence of early historicist readings of Daniel. Some in the early Christian church believe that Daniel had predicted events that were to take place after Daniel's time and before the end of the world. The early church fathers. The early Christian interpretations from the first 300 years seem to agree on seeing prophecies in Daniel as reaching past Daniel's time and into the Roman era. The first chapter of the Epistle of Barnabas appeals to the reader to consider the seriousness of the present circumstances, because the last stumbling block is at hand, and cites the fourth beast and the 10 horns of Daniel 7. Irenaeus likewise interpreted the fourth kingdom of Daniel 2 and 7 as the present-day Roman Empire, and believed that Rome, in Irenaeus' future, was going to be divided up into smaller kingdoms, as suggested by the iron mixed with clay in Daniel 2, and the 10 horns of the fourth beast in Daniel 7 and Revelation 13. If you're not familiar with how Daniel 7 and Revelation 13 overlap, then you need to know that, because it may help inform you the appropriate interpretation of apocalyptic literature. Revelation is not entirely future events. as seen by the comparison of Daniel 7 and Revelation 13, which basically proves the historicist method. And so if you are inclined to think the historicist method can be discarded outright for some frivolous reason, like you think Adventists are wrong, Adventists aren't the only ones that hold this view. And basically every Jew and early Christian throughout history took this approach. So you'd be well to take note of the reality, and then you probably already are recognizing and applying at least partly historicist methodology to your understanding of the two books. Tertullian asked his readers to pray for the stability and unity of the Roman Empire in order to delay the prophesied breakup of Rome and thus the coming of the Antichrist. Clement of Alexandria provided one of the first documented interpretations we have of Daniel 9, predicting the time of Jesus Christ's arrival. Eusebius followed the other early Christian writers in identifying the four kingdoms of Daniel 2 and 7 as Assyria, Babylonia, Persia, Greece, and Rome. The 70 weeks of Daniel 9, Eusebius saw as a 490-year prediction of the timing of Messiah, stretching from the Persian period to the time of Jesus. Cyril, the 4th century bishop of Jerusalem, wrote that the fourth kingdom, being Rome, was a well-established tradition in the church. The fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom upon earth, which shall surpass all kingdoms, and that this kingdom is that of the Romans, has been the tradition of the church's interpreters, according to Cyril of the 4th century. So, yes, the little horn is Roman, whom Christ will destroy with the brightness of his coming and the breath of his mouth, according to 2 Thessalonians 2. The Antichrist comes out of Rome. Jerome took the prediction fulfillments a step further, claiming that the time of the breakup of Rome, as he saw predicted in Daniel 2 and 7, had begun to take place in his time. He refuted the pagan Porphyry's proposal that Daniel was written in the 2nd century as an after the events took place narrative about Antiochus Epiphanes. Not sustainable. More names could be mentioned. The unified voice of the early Christian church, from the synoptic Jesus to the leading church historians and scholars of the formative years, was that the biblical apocalypses had in certain sections predicted events to take place in history from the time of their writing down to the end of the world. Historicism reigned. The Middle Ages. Historicist expositions were less common in the Middle Ages, due possibly to an increasing use of allegorical, ahistorical interpretations of Scripture in general, and Augustine's downplay of a literal second parousia, heretic, which the early church had seen in the Stone Kingdom replacing the Roman Empire in the prophecies of Daniel. So Augustine, again, got it wrong. Though no longer in the majority, the list of interpreters using the historicist approach to Daniel and Revelation is also long for the medieval period. One of the best known is Thomas Aquinas, who held the four kingdoms predicted in Daniel 2 and 7 to be Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. The 10 horns as 10 future kings to come in the time of Antichrist, and the 70 weeks of Daniel 9 as 490 lunar years predicting the coming of Jesus. According to Froome, other lesser-known medieval interpreters using the historicist approach were Bruno of Segni, Anselm of Havelberg, Rupert of Deutz, Andries of Caesarea, Sargus da Bergia, Berengod, Pseudo Methodius, Bede, Robert Grosseteste, identifying the papacy as the Antichrist, Peter Comister, Albertus Magnus, Joachim of Florus, the 7 seals and 7 trumpets covering the Christian era. Yeah, score one for the historicist. Villanova, urging fellow preachers to preach more on the prophecies, including Daniel 9, which he believed foretold the time of Jesus' first advent. Olivier, who believed the Christian church had become corrupt, is prophesied in the symbol of Babylon in Revelation, and that the 7 seals and 7 trumpets are 7 periods of church history. Emperor Frederick II, who held the Pope to be the predicted Antichrist. Eberhard, who claimed the papal system was predicted in the Little Horn of Daniel. Dante, Francesco Petrarch, John Millix, and the Waldensian Christians, who believed the corruption of the Christian church was predicted in the symbols of the harlot and Babylon of Revelation. And I think Froome's work is free to read and is highly respected among the greater Christian community. He is a Seventh-day Adventist, but he did very, very thorough work and his scholarship. I mean, with just outrageous amounts of citations and work, especially for his time. I think in the 50s, maybe. He went way overboard, unlike anyone else has, with his, getting every possible manuscript available. I mean, if he lived today, he'd probably have written the Christian Interpreter dictionary with the access he would have today with the internet. Renaissance and Reformation. With the Protestant Reformation, we return again to a period of dominance for the historicist approach. I mention here only two major early writers. The English morning star of the Reformation, John Wycliffe, believed strongly that the corruption of the papacy was the event predicted in the prophecies of the Antichrist, the little horn of Daniel 7, and the harlot woman of Revelation 17. You guys, it's undeniable. God did not leave us blank for all of Christian history when Jesus Christ and his covenant is the focus of Scripture and of God's purpose. To think that's all just crammed into the future is absolutely outrageous. The four kingdoms of Daniel 2 and 7 were Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. When Martin Luther saw what he considered as the hopelessness of reforming the Church of Rome, he became increasingly convinced that it was apostate and that this apostasy was predicted in Daniel and Revelation, as I highly recommend you concur with. When Luther burned the Pope's bull of excommunication, he burned it as the bull of the prophesied Antichrist of Babylon and Babylon. Luther's view on Daniel was the traditional one. The fourth kingdom was the Roman Empire. While the breakup of iron into clay in the feet predicted the breakup of the Roman Empire into smaller nations, Luther wrote that it was common knowledge that the 70 weeks of Daniel 9 should be interpreted with a day for a year and that it predicted the death of Christ. This historicist approach to prophecy remained the common and accepted approach among Protestants for the next 300 years, to such a degree that scholars sometimes define historicism simply as the approach to prophesy of Protestants up until the mid-19th century. Let me read that again. Luther's view on Daniel was the traditional one. The fourth kingdom was the Roman Empire. That's a fact. Well, the breakup of iron into clay in the feet of Daniel 2 predicted the breakup of the Roman Empire into smaller nations. And if we follow that line that Daniel gives us, it doesn't leave a blank spot in history. It describes Christian history right up until Christ's soon return. Sooner every day. The historicist approach to prophecy remained the common and accepted approach among Protestants for the next 300 years, to such a degree that scholars sometimes define historicism simply as the approach to prophecy of Protestants up until the mid-19th century, when dispensationalism took hold. Today, the Seventh-day Adventist Church is the only major denomination officially using the historicist approach. This is why we claim a Protestant lineage. Largely why we do, for other reasons as well. The most common approach during 2 millennia of biblical apocalyptic interpretation. If Adventists wish to see the use of historicism increased among other interpreters, it might be necessary to change the way the approach is communicated. Many scholars do not believe in the possibility of true predictive prophecy, and the gap between Adventists and these interpreters cannot be closed. The community of believers who are open to this possibility is large. However, in our days, as it has always been, to these people, Adventists should demonstrate carefully from the biblical text, case by case, where and why one sees history in advance. Thank you. That's all.